Hello friends, welcome to our channel History Chronicles. The sun rises over the French countryside, casting a golden light over the fields. But this beauty is deceptive. Beneath the calm facade, a storm is brewing, a storm of hunger, anger, and despair. The peasants who till these fields are facing a reality that no amount of sunlight can brighten. There is no food. The grain they rely on for survival has dwindled to almost nothing, and what little remains is priced beyond their reach. The year is 1788, and France is on the brink of a revolution, one fueled not just by ideas, but by empty stomachs. Imagine waking up every day with the gnawing ache of hunger. For months, you've watched as the crops you planted with such hope have withered away, destroyed by unrelenting cold and rain. You've seen your children cry themselves to sleep, their bellies empty, their eyes full of fear. You've sold whatever you could, the family cow, your last bit of land, just to buy a few scraps of bread, and now, even that is gone. This is the reality faced by millions of French peasants in the late 1780s, a reality that would soon ignite the fires of revolution. The crisis wasn't just a sudden event, it was the result of years of neglect and mismanagement by the ruling classes. The feudal system that dominated rural France was designed to benefit the nobles and the church at the expense of the peasantry. The taxes were heavy, the tithes were mandatory, and the corvée, unpaid or required by the lords, left the peasants with little time to tend to their own needs. Even in good years, life was a struggle. But in the late 1780s, it became unbearable. The winter of 1787 to 1788 was particularly harsh. A bitter cold gripped the land, freezing rivers and making travel nearly impossible. The fields, blanketed in snow, lay dormant. When spring finally arrived, it brought with it devastating floods that washed away what little hope the peasants had left. The summer that followed was no better. Drought parched the earth, leaving the crops stunted and the wells dry. The harvest that year was one of the worst in living memory. The grain stores, already depleted, ran dry. Bread, the staple of the French diet, became a luxury that few could afford. In the cities, the situation was equally dire. Bread riots erupted as desperate urban workers, unable to feed their families, took to the streets. The cries of "bread, bread" echoed through the narrow alleys of Paris, Lyon, and other major cities. Women, who bore the brunt of the hardship as they struggled to provide for their children, were often at the forefront of these protests. They stormed bakeries, demanding that prices be lowered and hoarded grain be released. The authorities, unable to quell the unrest, responded with force. But this only fueled the anger of the people. As the crisis deepened, rumors began to spread like wildfire. Whispers of grain hoarding by the nobles and the clergy circulated through the villages and towns. It was said that the aristocrats were deliberately withholding grain to drive up prices and starve the poor into submission. Whether these rumors were true or not mattered little. They fed into the growing resentment against the ruling classes. The people, already pushed to the brink, were now convinced that they were being deliberately starved. The king, Louis XVI, was seen as indifferent, even callous, to the suffering of his people. He continued to live in luxury at Versailles, seemingly oblivious to the misery that plagued the nation. When news of the bread riots reached the royal court, the response was one of disbelief and disdain. How could the people be so ungrateful, so unruly? The king's ministers, desperate to maintain order, urged him to take a stronger stance, to crush the uprisings before they spread further. But Louis XVI, indecisive and weak, hesitated. His failure to act decisively only emboldened the revolutionaries. It wasn't just the peasants and urban workers who were suffering. The middle class, or bourgeoisie, who had once enjoyed relative prosperity, were also feeling the pinch. Many had invested heavily in land, hoping to profit from the agricultural economy. But now, with the collapse of the harvests and the skyrocketing price of bread, their investments were worthless. Their anger at the feudal system, which prevented them from achieving true wealth and power, grew. They began to see themselves as the natural leaders of a movement to overthrow the old order and replace it with something new, something more just and equitable. One story that spread across France during this time was that of a small village in the countryside. The villagers, facing starvation, had reached out to their local lord for help, but instead of providing them with the grain they so desperately needed, The Lord had locked his stores and increased the price of bread. Enraged, the villagers gathered in the square, their faces gaunt with hunger, but their eyes blazing with determination. They marched to the Lord's manor, demanding that he open his granaries. When he refused, the villagers took matters into their own hands. They broke down the doors, seized the grain, and distributed it among themselves. The Lord, terrified and powerless, fled the village, leaving his once loyal subjects to fend for themselves. This story, whether true or not, became a symbol of the growing defiance among the common people. It showed that they were no longer willing to accept their fate quietly. They were ready to fight for their survival, even if it meant challenging the very foundations of society. By the time 1789 dawned, the subsistence crisis had reached a tipping point. The people of France, driven to desperation by hunger and poverty, were no longer content to live under a system that exploited them. They demanded change, and they were willing to fight for it. The stage was set for the events that would soon follow: the calling of the Estates General, the formation of the National Assembly, and the storming of the Bastille. But before we dive into those momentous events, it's important to understand how the ideas of the Enlightenment, which had been simmering in the background, began to fuse with the anger and desperation of the common people. In our next episode, we'll explore how the philosophies of thinkers like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu provided the intellectual fuel for the revolution. We'll see how these ideas spread among the people, giving them not just the will, but the justification to rise up against their oppressors. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the French Revolution. Stay tuned for the next episode of History Chronicles. See you next time.